Because of the fact that the NBA draft is steadily approaching, we're going to be continuing on that topic just as I have been basically all week. Only this time, today's video is going to be a bit different. Since this is the last draft of the decade, today we'll be taking a look back at every draft of the decade and picking the player that failed the hardest from each draft in comparison to their draft position, hype, and expectations at the time, or in other words, became the biggest bust from that draft. Obviously, I won't be including this year's draft because 1, it hasn't happened yet, and 2, the players haven't even played a single minute in the NBA yet, but every other draft of the decade will be included. Before we start though, make sure to subscribe to the channel as all support is very much appreciated. Now with that being said, let's begin. Starting with the very first draft of the decade in 2010, the biggest bust from that draft class was one of the easier ones to choose, being Evan Turner, who was picked 2nd overall by the Philadelphia 76ers. Now, by no means is Turner a total bust by any means, and he has had a few solid years in his career where he produced at least a decent rate, but he was rated as high as he was at the time of the draft because he was seen as someone with a complete all-around game with a good chance of becoming an all-star player. Meanwhile, in reality, he's only ever been a mediocre scorer with efficiency issues, and his impact on the floor for the most part has been negative, as teams have rarely had positive net ratings with him on the floor. Plus, when you look at some of the names of players that were drafted a few picks later, such as DeMarcus Cousins, Gordon Hayward, and Paul George, taking Turner as high as the Sixers did looks even worse in hindsight. Moving on to the 2011 draft, the biggest bust from this draft class was a bit more difficult to choose because there were a few candidates that really disappointed in a big way, but the player I settled on was Derrick Williams, who was also selected 2nd overall by the Minnesota Timberwolves. The Timberwolves back then were one of the worst franchises in the league, having been hovering near the bottom of the standings year in and year out since they lost Kevin Garnett. Getting a pick as high as 2 could have done them a lot to help them get back on track, but Williams was a complete flop of a pick. Coming out of college, his athleticism was tantalizing for NBA scouts, and his jump shot had shown a bit of promise for him to be able to stretch the floor, but in the NBA, unfortunately, none of that translated. He struggled mightily to score the ball, having been grossly inefficient for a big man throughout his career, and defensively, he didn't really put up much of a fight either. The draft featured guys like Klay Thompson, Kawhi Leonard, and Kemba Walker later on too, so this one really stung the Wolves for a while. Next up in the 2012 draft, the biggest bust from this class was Thomas Robinson, who was taken 5th overall by the Sacramento Kings. The 2012 draft was a pretty damn good class looking back, with basically every top 10 pick becoming a useful contributor in their team's rotations. Well, all except one. The Kings, like the Timberwolves at the time, were at a very low place, also hovering around the bottom of the standings year in and year out, and their drafting track record didn't exactly help. Similar to Derrick Williams, Robinson was a phenomenal athlete and dominated the paint in college while throwing down some incredible dunks in the process. In some of his pre-draft scouting reports, he was even being compared to Blake Griffin, yet when he finally got to the league, he never even came close to being a legitimate contributor, only ever averaging more than 5 points per game one season, and even then he barely eclipsed that mark. Sometimes you can have all of the physical tools and natural gifts in the world, but skill tends to win out more often than not. Moving on now to the 2013 draft, the biggest bust from this class is someone who is legitimately in contention for being the biggest bust in the history of the NBA, being none other than Anthony Bennett, who got drafted 1st overall by the Cleveland Cavaliers. This pick was so bad that even at the time it was announced on draft night, everyone went into a frenzy questioning the pick, including Bill Simmons letting out a massive "whoa" live on air. Despite all of the doubt, people were willing to give him a chance to prove himself worthy of the top spot though, but unfortunately he just never even came close to doing that. he struggled to stay in shape throughout most of his career, put up historically bad numbers, and had just about the worst start to a top pick's career ever, going completely scoreless in his first 4 games while shooting 0 for 15 in those games. Once his rookie contract expired, he never got a second contract and is currently in the G League trying to work his way back onto a roster. Moving on to the 2014 draft, the biggest bust from this class might be a controversial choice because calling him a bust may sound harsh, but putting it all into context will hopefully validate my reasoning for it, and that player is Andrew Wiggins, who was taken first overall by the Cleveland Cavaliers, but immediately was traded to the Minnesota Timberwolves. Coming out of high school and even college, many labeled Wiggins as the next LeBron James, and regardless of whether or not you agreed with that comparison, the reality was that he was seen as a franchise-altering player that could become a cornerstone of a contender for the next decade. Wiggins has now played 5 seasons in the league, and the only thing he's done is put up empty scoring numbers on subpar efficiency while struggling immensely at virtually every other aspect of the game. He's a terrible defender, is a bit of a black hole on offense that doesn't create for others, and takes a ton of low-quality shots on a regular basis. Plus, he is now being paid a max contract despite having never done anything to earn it, making the entire situation one big mess. Next up is the 2015 draft, and the biggest bust in this class is one Jahlil Okafor, who got taken 3rd overall by the Philadelphia 76ers. Okafor is a pretty disappointing situation for a number of reasons. At the time, D'Angelo Russell was the player that the Sixers were hoping to get and didn't even necessarily want Okafor, but Russell was off the board, so they were left to choose between him or Kristaps Porzingis. Porzingis was a major unknown at the time, with very limited footage being available of him, and he also refused to work out for the Sixers beforehand, so they went with the player they knew in Okafor, which turned out to bite them in the ass pretty hard. He was compared to Tim Duncan on the offensive end at the time because his advanced post moves and offensive skill set down low were reminiscent. However, his defense was and still is to this day dreadful. He's been one of the worst defensive big men in the league since he played his first game, and his offensive skill set is fairly outdated. Back to the basket go-to scorers just don't thrive anymore, especially when they're defensive liabilities, and at this point, he's got to fight as hard as he can just to stick around on a roster. Next up is the 2016 draft, and the biggest bust from this class has to be Dragan Bender, who was drafted 4th overall by the Phoenix Suns. After Kristaps Porzingis became a big-time player as an international big man, the Suns were hoping to hit a similar kind of home run with Bender, but unfortunately, Bender just hasn't been able to put it all together. His appeal was his perimeter shooting for a big man, yet his shot has been streaky at best and terribly inefficient. He's also pretty skinny and has constantly been out-muscled by his opponents, and on top of all of that, he's struggled with a few injuries. At this point, his value is as low as it possibly can be, and he may no longer even be part of the Suns' long-term plans. Now moving on to the 2017 draft, the biggest bust from this class may still have time to turn things around, but he's had one of the craziest and most frustrating starts to a career I've ever seen in my life, being Markelle Fultz, who was taken 1st overall by the Philadelphia 76ers. In college, Fultz looked like the next great point guard with explosive athleticism, a crafty handle, and shot creation reminiscent to James Harden. At the time, he was almost unanimously the best prospect in the class, but then all of that changed when he suddenly forgot how to shoot a basketball. The reasoning for why that happened to this day has still not been fully clarified, but apparently it is because of something called TOS, which is a shoulder injury. In each of his first 2 seasons so far, he's gone very long stretches without much update to how his recovery is going and seems to just disappear. It's extremely hard to tell what's going on with him, but for the time being, he's made basically zero impact on the league at all after being taken at the top of a very talented draft. Now, finally, to conclude this video with the 2018 draft, the biggest bust from last year's class is not really easy to decide because they've all only played 1 year, and writing someone off after their rookie years is just dumb. However, for the sake of the video, I'll make a decision based a little off of prediction combined with how they played as a rookie, and the player I decided on was Bamba. Bamba was an enticing prospect last year because of his incredible length and height at the center position, combined with his ability to block shots and protect the rim at a high level. Defense was his calling card, but his offensive game needed some work. As a rookie last year, he struggled immensely on both ends of the floor, and the Magic, who by the way were a playoff team last year, struggled mightily with him on the floor, posting a net rating of -15.2. Bamba was still a good shot blocker, but overall on defense he got bullied because he's too skinny to match up with some of the stronger bigs in the game, and offensively he rarely ever made much impact. By no means am I saying that he is a bust, just that out of all of the top prospects from last year's class, he's looking like the one most likely to be a bust. And with that being said, that's all I have for you today. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a like on the video for daily NBA content. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.